Okay, so I'm on a bit of a roll this evening with videos, but they're all topical issues, and I do want to make them whilst I'm looking at the material. So, I was watching a debate on Scottish independence on Question Time. It covered other things as well, but the main focus was Scottish independence. And there was one interesting segment. This is a debate from last year, I believe it was June. There was one interesting segment in a very bizarre situation when George Galloway actually defended Nigel Farage. Now, I say that's very unusual because you have one of Britain's most hard left politicians defending a leading right winger, and that was somewhat bizarre. But whilst I don't particularly like either man, and I would not align myself with either man, Galloway made some pretty good points that were hard not to agree with. And he raised an issue which I'll talk more about the debate itself in a minute, but I want to talk about one incident that happened in Edinburgh shortly before this debate, and Galloway referred to it. He said that there was a situation that Nigel Farage was basically hounded out of Edinburgh in a sense, and what that done was give a very ugly image for Scotland, both in the wider United Kingdom and around the world. Now, I've just watched that clip to see the context, and indeed it is very ugly. But anyway, Galloway was saying that whilst he finds UKIP as a party deplorable, he will defend to the death the right for Mr. Farage to have an opinion. So to George Galloway's credit, that is an example of him being statesmanlike. Now, I don't particularly like George Galloway. In fact, I don't. I find a lot of his rhetoric to be far left rubbish. But on this occasion, I think he made a very good point. And it is very important that someone like George Galloway said that, because the very people who were attacking Farage were far left yobs, basically. So basically what happened was Nigel Farage was there to give a speech representing UKIP, and he was in an Edinburgh pub. There's lots of videos about this so you can see yourself. I'll put a link to one of them. And he's confronted by this group of people. Apparently they're students. I don't know exactly what organisation they represent. I don't know if they're SNP supporters. I don't know exactly who they represent. But basically it's very, very ugly scenes. You have this situation where this bunch of yobs are yelling in Farage's face, calling him a homophobe, a sexist, a racist, not letting him get a word in, hounding him, following him around aggressively, yelling scum, scum, scum at the top of their lungs. Now, and there was chants of go back to England and things like this. There's several videos of it. Now, some of them will claim they're not motivated by anti-English rhetoric, and maybe some of them aren't. But whatever way you look at it, what they were doing was anything but democratic. So something ironic about people who are claiming to be about good values, like for example equality of the sexes and anti-homophobia and that sort of thing, anti-racism, and yet their behaviour is extremely undemocratic. As far as I'm concerned, people who behave like that are really no better than fascists. They say that UKIP is a fascist party. I don't like UKIP, by the way. I'm not a UKIP supporter. I've made that clear many times. In fact, I really don't like some of UKIP's policies. But if you think that opposing them should take this sort of format, then you're delusional. And their behaviour is absolutely no better than what the National Front does against ethnic minorities. Really, it's not. What is the difference when you think about it? When you really think about it on the surface, both the far right and the far left shout down anyone who they disagree with. Both the far right and the far left come out with conspiracy theories. Both the far right and the far left shout down people with a different opinion. Both the far right and the far left claim to have a consensus when actually they represent no one but themselves. So I wouldn't be surprised if these people were unite against fascism, because I regard them as an extreme organisation. They use anti-racism as a cover for their disgusting behaviour. Now, I am not a UKIP supporter, but if they think that sort of behaviour is going to expose UKIP, they're deluded. The way to expose UKIP's flaws is by debating with them in an adult manner, by engaging in the political process. Because in the end of the day, Nigel Farage is a democratically elected politician who has a lot of support. UKIP is now the UK's fourth largest party, and it might well be true that they're not that popular in Scotland. But that isn't the point. The point, as Galloway put it, was, is this how the future Scotland is going to look if Scotland gets independence? Us and them, shouting down anyone that the nationalists disagree with. And I do believe that mob was motivated by nationalism just as much as their perceived outrage about UKIP's policies. So this really frustrates me, that these people can be so stupid that they cannot see how their behaviour comes across. Fine, they can hate UKIP policies, they can be concerned about UKIP policies, they can regard UKIP as a fascist party. I don't believe it is actually, but if they want that opinion, fine. But their behaviour is actually fascist in itself, because it's undemocratic, or you could equally say it's communist. Either way, it's undemocratic. It's just so hypocritical to talk about democracy and then try to shout someone down. What you had was one man trying to deal with a mob, not being able to get a word in. How can that be the right atmosphere for any sort of debate? It's pathetic. So anyway, when this issue was brought up on Question Time, I'll give George Galloway credit for denouncing their behaviour, and you will find few people as anti-UKIP as George Galloway. In fact, on the independence issue, George Galloway has come out in support of the Union on the grounds that socialists should unite. And this is another issue I want to talk about. By the way, there was a young man in that studio audience who came out and said, oh, well, you know, you got that treatment in Edinburgh, Farage, but if I went to England, the exact same thing would happen. Well, there's no hard evidence that there's major racism against Scottish people in England. I'm not saying it never happens, but that sort of caricature that young man put across is a lot of rubbish. At the very most, you might get some mimicking of accents, but certainly not behaviour like that. I would like that young man, or anyone else who believes that, to provide an example of the last time an individual Scottish person was attacked by an English mob in England. I haven't seen any evidence of it. Now, I'm from Northern Ireland, and I'll be honest, when I first arrived in England I had a pretty rough time because we happened to live in an inner city area. But that doesn't mean it's the status quo. It doesn't mean all English are like that. And I'm not going to generalise 54 million English people because we had to put up with some yobs. But the point is, that young man was saying, I don't know if he had personally had a bad experience, but I believe the reality is that this is what is happening, and it's what this whole debate is doing. I think it's very alarming, because the direction of this debate is becoming increasingly bitter, and I'm getting fed up with the sort of them and us mentality that the nationalists are promoting. One of the most common pieces of deception that they put out is this is Tories versus Scotland, and North versus South, and this sort of thing. As George Galloway pointed out, London has many pockets of dismal poverty, and London has some of the most glaring examples of Britain's wealth-poverty divide. Now, it's absolutely true, Britain is a shamefully divided country in terms of wealth-poverty, but to caricature that as North versus South is misleading, because there's places in the South, there's parts of London that are absolutely horrendous in terms of the social deprivation and crime and so on. In fact, London has the highest crime rates in the country, apart from perhaps Glasgow. So that's a very misleading thing to say it's a case of, London's is the land of privilege. The reality is there's a minority of people in London who have privilege, and there's millions of others who don't. Another thing is this argument that it's Toryism versus Scotland. Now, it happens, I think it's unfortunate that this whole debate comes at a time when there happens to be a Tory-led government, because it gives propaganda to the nationalists. But the point is, Cameron isn't going to be Prime Minister forever. The Tories are not going to be in government forever. There'll be a Labour government someday. And Labour is very, very influential in Scotland. So one of the most deceptive things the Nationalists are doing is trying to make out that it is the Tories versus Scotland. Liberal Democrats and Labour, many of whom their supporters despise the Tories, do not share this vision of breaking up the United Kingdom. So, they argue about what Thatcher done to Scotland, and that's a fair argument, but the problem is they're ignoring the fact that she also caused a lot of division in English society. I mean, the north of England has the part of England I come from hates Thatcher just as much as Scotland does. So this is a misleading thing, and again, it's them and us. This sort of them and us mentality, the English Tories versus the Scottish Socialists. It's a lot of crap. Now, it's true that the Tories don't have much support in Scotland, but this, again, it comes down to them and us mentality, and that is what this whole debate is fostering. Now, the SNP say they're not the only people pushing for independence. That is true, but they are at the very helm of it. And whilst you won't hear anti-English rhetoric from someone like Alex Salmond directly, if you look at cybernats, if you look at the sort of rhetoric they come out with, just look at any video about the debate on the Union, look at the sort of rants that cybernats come out with, almost always stoked by anti-English racism. It's very ugly. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some on the English side who do come out with generalising statements about Scots, and that annoys me as well, but the sheer amount of vitriol from nationalists, I believe, is overwhelming right now. And if that is going to be the future of Scotland, then it's not a good sign at all. If that's going to be the future of Scotland, them and us. And basically there's something very toxic about this notion that either you vote yes or you're not a real Scot. That is the rhetoric that is coming out from the Yes campaign. Now, I am not saying that every Yes voter is an extremist. I'm not saying that for a second. I think there's many people who are genuinely unsure about which way to go, and maybe they see some appealing arguments with the Yes campaign. I respect their opinion. I'm a unionist. I want this country to stay together, but I do respect their right to have an opinion. And I also acknowledge the fact that not everyone who's going to vote yes is an English-hating extremist. The problem is, there's a hell of a lot of them. If you look at the behaviour of cybernats, they're very vocal, very influential, and there's a hell of a lot of them. So what I would say is it comes down to moderate nationalists to rein in on those people. And for our part, I think unionists need to, I don't agree with everything unions say. So for example, some unionists have compared Alex Salmond to Kim Jong-un. I think that's a bit ridiculous. Although I'm a staunch unionist, I've seen other things that unionists have come out with. But I do believe that most of the racist behaviour has come from the nationalist side. And I do believe that most of the them and us behaviour has come from the nationalist side. Well, in fact, that is the whole logic of their argument, them and us. And it's very much they're turning it into Scotland versus England rather than the ups and downs of independence. So I think it's very unfortunate. I'm going to make other videos about this subject because I believe it's absolutely critical. But what happened to Nigel Farage is just the tip of the iceberg, because this is what a future Scotland could potentially look like. Now, of course, senior politicians like Alex Salmond and Mr. Angus Robertson will not use that sort of rhetoric. Of course, they will never say anything anti-English because they're clever politicians. But if you look at some of their supporters, there's a very dark side to Scottish nationalism. And it's motivated not only by anti-English racism, but by division in Scottish society, by stigmatising Scots who vote for the Union, by saying they're not real Scots. And I've seen this. I've seen things like fucking traitors go back to England, tartan Tories fuck off, this sort of thing, even if they're not even Tory supporters. Now, I'm a unionist. There's many Tory policies I hate, and I've been branded fucking Tory, go back to London, even though I'm not English, I'm not from London, and I'm not a Tory voter. So I'm not saying that all nationalists are like this. I'm not saying that for a second. But I do believe that there's something very dark on the underbelly of Scottish nationalism that is another point I'd like to raise. A lot of media reports recently have been accusing the No campaign of being more negative, but it isn't the No campaign that is fostering a them and us mentality, it's the Yes campaign that's been doing that. Of course, the No campaign has responsibility to promote what is good about the UK and what is important about staying together, and I think actually they have. In the end of the day, we're only going to find out on September the 18th. I staunchly hope the Union stays together. Is the United Kingdom perfect? No. Is Scotland in the United Kingdom a perfect situation? No. But there's just too many question marks about Scottish independence. There's too many inconsistencies about the SNP argument. And in my opinion, there's a very dark side to Scottish nationalism. I'm not saying every Scottish nationalist is like that, but if that's what future Scotland is going to look like, what we saw with Nigel Farage is only a tip of the iceberg. And you know what? Angus Robertson barely even criticised that. He had an opportunity on that panel to criticise that, and he didn't do it. He said, "Oh, I support your right to free speech," but not once did he condemn the behaviour of those thugs. And that's all they are, thugs.